afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Buon pomeriggio. Welcome to this conference on the Balkans and the Black Sea perspective, and we hope to have a good discussion this afternoon. I welcome you many people. This is a good thing. I hope that you have an interesting discussion. We are not new in debating these issues in our annual conference, and we are proud of the consistency of our focus on this region since many years, since the foundation of this foundation, because it is part of our project which is called Strategic Balkans, and it consists on an annual conference and also dedicated research dossier and by a monthly journal on the Balkans dating back to 2017 in English that we would like to be more popular. We are speaking of the Balkans and the Black Sea, but in other words, we are speaking about Southeastern Europe. This is the reality. To answer the question on why we have worked so much in this direction is simple to my mind, because this region has always been crucial for European security, at the crossroads of many interests and ambitions, be it local nationalism, often, or being an objective of various external actors, including Russia. And the region shares also common problems, from fragile economies to embattled democracies, and sometimes to illegal trafficking and environmental damages. These facts and events do not belong just to history. And today, Southeastern Europe is more important than ever. And we had a very important summit yesterday in Tirana showing that I'm saying the truth. And we wish to accompany the region from fragmentation to inclusion, from instability to security, to modern government and to the rule of law. In conclusion, is an easy conclusion, the Balkan and the Black Sea region should become integral part of the Euro-Atlantic community. And I underline that NATO and the European Union have been working hand in hand according to the added value and in the same direction, which is the direction of inclusion. The good news is that this intent is agreed on both sides of the Atlantic. For its part, NATO remains in Kosovo with its ongoing KFOR operation, while the aim remains the same, which is to project security. The European Union is now engaged in a renewed effort, and we see it every day, as I said yesterday, for instance, to facilitate the process of full integration. And if we look at the overall scenario, the Russian aggression and the ensuing war in Ukraine have added a certain sense of urgency to this matter in favor of the region, since it has to be stable and to remain able, facing old and new challenges. Local problems continue to be relevant beyond their borders. Serbia and Kosovo face unsolved disputes. Bosnia and Herzegovina remains a fragile state. The economic and demographic situations are a source of concern. This is not new. After having said that, the Foundation is addressing in today's debate a number of relevant issues that are sometimes overlooked. As always, our purpose is to promote a friendly discussion aimed at helping to find good solutions, to encourage the actors to continue in their efforts, keeping the issue at the center of strategic discussions on real priorities for the international community, and hence for the Euro-Atlantic community. As always, we give a priority to voices coming from the region. And you see from the nationality and the number of speakers coming here today. And there is no substitute for that. It is almost 12 years that we do so, and today we are proud to welcome a large number of speakers and moderators with unparalleled experience, sometimes old friends and now some new friends, And we are happy that they have accepted this invitation, also because we think that Rome is a natural and appropriate, privileged place to discuss about the region. As in our tradition, the spirit of the event is to promote an informed debate at a scientific level and with reciprocal respect. We are encouraged by the fact that today the area is finally clearly seen being an international priority, part of 360 security approach. You see from the program that you have received that we are touching upon crucial issues like democracy, gray areas, the aspiration to reforms, the final inclusion in the European Union and the Atlantic Alliance. All this is certainly not new, but events show that it remains important, not just along the shores of the Black Sea, but also on those of the Mediterranean. I conclude my remarks, welcoming you today here, thanking, first of all, our entire staff of the Foundation for their enthusiasm and their very good work, because the preparation of such a conference, as you imagine, requires a lot of detailed attention and dedication. Special thanks to those who have helped to produce the event: Philip Morris International, the NATO Public Diplomacy Division, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, and the College. And I also have to announce, sadly, that our good friend Nicola De Santis, representing public diplomacy, is not here today because he had just been attacked by COVID, unfortunately. We are not yet out of that. And so I hope he is seeing us in remote, but anyway, I wish him really well, and I thank him for his continued support to the Foundation. And now I give the floor, buon pomeriggio a tutti, welcome, and we'll have a good discussion. And now Ambassador Terracciano, who is the Director General for Public Diplomacy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to start by thanking Ambassador President Minuto Rizzo and Director Alessandro Politi of the NATO Defense College for this kind of invitation. Of course, I'm very proud to be one of the supporters, but my Directorate General for Public and Cultural Diplomacy is one of the supporters of this event. And I'm convinced that today's conference is extremely timely. And the reason is simple. The Balkans and the Black Sea region are experiencing a relevant degree of political uncertainty and insecurity, which have direct effects on the European countries and their international organizations, namely NATO and the EU. This uncertainty is caused by a wide range of ongoing political and social dynamics, which make the regional context more complex and consequently less predictable. And as you know, in foreign policy, this is not good news, definitely. The Russian aggression against Ukraine is a most serious disruptive event with multidimensional implications. And one of these implications is the importance of the maritime dimension in the current great power competition. And in that sense, the strategic role of the Black Sea and the Balkan region as bridges between Russia and the Mediterranean Sea. Other relevant issues deserve attention. The slow progress in regional integration, the existence of pervasive transnational criminal networks, and the tensions possibly undermining democratic regimes. The three topics that the conference panels will tackle today are, in fact, interconnected key issues, which can shape the future of the region and its relationship with the other European countries. Regional integration seems to be swimming in troubled waters, if not drowning, risking at least. On the other hand, the attempts to foster the economic integration between the Western Balkan countries, for instance, through the Open Balkan Initiative, have not achieved the expected results yet. On the other hand, the EU-Western Balkans integration process is at a crossroads. The enlargement process is proceeding at a slow and uneven pace, generating frustration in the candidates' countries. Other different political initiatives, like the recent European Political Community, can be explored, provided they do not reduce the incentives to the enlargement process. The lack of European political interest and activism in the region is risky, since other assertive players, such as China and Russia, can quickly replace our influence. Political integration can become a factor of stability, but it requires a good level of domestic security and good governance in order to be implemented. In other words, the persistence of illicit trade and criminal networks has a direct impact on the democratic functioning of the countries, which in turn is essential to ensure stability and to back any political cooperation or integration initiative. The only way to break this vicious circle is to rely on a more active involvement of the principal international organization operating in the area, NATO and the European Union, as I've mentioned already, together, of course, with the UN and the OSCE. Sometimes these multilateral actors could do better maybe with some further coordination efforts. But I think that it exists an underlying commonality of interests and values among them. If successfully managed, a similar coordinated action could produce an efficient burden sharing. However, there are two essential conditions if we want this path to work effectively. The first one is a strong and coordinated political will by the member states of the organizations involved, which means a serious availability to engage in negotiations and to search for viable compromises. Second, a constant and frank dialogue with all the countries in the region, especially through multilateral fora. In one word, more diplomacy is needed. In this sense, Italy will keep ensuring its contribution and efforts to reinforce political dialogue and cooperation in the area. As recently stated by Minister Tajani during his visit to Serbia, Italy wants to be a protagonist in the Balkans as an actor of peace. In the following months, we will work to offer new spaces of dialogue, both between the representatives of the governments and the members of the civil society. The listening and the involvement of non-state actors is another important action that we cannot leave to other countries and their propaganda. So we are planning, actually, maybe many of you or some of you were present at the Rome Med Dialogues last week. I think it's a very successful format, an event of dialogue among governments, civil society experts that we have been running for 8 years now with ISPI, in conjunction with ISPI. We are planning to do something similar for the Balkan region together with IAI, the other big Italian think tank. And we are working, it will be at ministerial level. Minister Tajani already announced this, his intention of convening here to Rome the major players of the Balkan regions, maybe in March. And I think this will be another good contribution for this global dialogue. And I'm sure that the reflections and ideas that will come out of this conference today will be extremely useful to all people, including ourselves, who will be part of this process. So I wish you a very fruitful discussion. Thank you.
So I think we can start the works of the day, the real ones. The first panel comes here with our good friend Ivan Vejvoda as the chair.
Anywhere. Good afternoon from me, and thank you to Ambassador Minuto Rizzo, President of the Foundation, and of course to Alessandro Politi, Director, and all the colleagues at the NATO Defense College Foundation. It's always a true pleasure to be part of this network, but also to be a participant in these activities. As you know, we are going to have an hour and 10 minutes of conversation on this first panel, which is about the regional integration initiatives. My name is Ivan Vejvoda. I'm a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Otherwise, I come from Belgrade, Serbia. Just to briefly introduce the panelists, you have detailed biographies of them, which I urge you to read. To my immediate left is Solomon Pasi, who is the president of the Atlantic Council of Bulgaria, but much more importantly was foreign minister of Bulgaria. He played a key role in Bulgaria's integration into the European Union and NATO and many other things, along with being a professor of mathematics. So I think you're the only scientist on our panel, which might enlighten us on some things. To Solomon's left is Professor Ahmet Evin, who is an emeritus professor of Sabancı University, a renowned scholar, a prolific writer and analyst on what today we call a middle power called Turkey, but also on transatlantic and other issues, and of course the important role that Turkey plays today. I'm sure we'll hear many interesting things. And last but not least, to my far left is Bruno Lette, who is with the German Marshall Fund of the United States. He's a senior analyst there. In full transparency, Bruno and I were colleagues when I was with the German Marshall Fund in Belgrade and in Washington. He is one of the preeminent analysts on the transatlantic relationship, on the Eastern neighborhood, as it was once called. Don't know what we call it exactly today, but we might get into that as well. Just a couple of words of introduction, and I think it's important to repeat what our introductory speaker said. We have had a plethora of very important events over the past weeks. And of course, everything is under the shadow of the Russian aggression, the unprovoked invasion of a European country of 44 million people called Ukraine. This has put upside down the whole architecture, the security and geopolitical balance that we have in Europe, and we are all grappling with the fallout that is occurring in so many dimensions, globally, European-wise, but also regionally. And obviously all this in a situation where we have a G2 competition between the United States and China, where the issue of climate is preeminent. The COP has just finished at Sharm el-Sheikh, and we are dealing with a series of areas of challenges in what we call the global commons. And so that is why it is important that we address these issues in this region of the Balkans and the Black Sea. Tirana was mentioned. The European Union went to the region, if I may say so, to use that famous saying. It was the mountain that went to Muhammad this time, namely the big European Union. The mountain went to the small actor, which is this region from where I and Solomon and Turkey also was part of the Balkans. I remember Turkey participated in the Balkan Games when I was a kid. So I think that the European Union has been jolted out of its complacency with regard to this region, that it realizes that the credibility of the whole project is at stake, and that the integration process needs to advance much more robustly. And now, of course, we have Ukraine and Moldova as countries that are candidates, and possibly Georgia as well. So it's a bigger game. And if I may just add that the question of proportion, in the Balkans, we used to say 18 million, but with the demographic decline, which we may address, I think we're rather at about 16 million people at this point, which, compared to Ukraine, is a third of the population of Ukraine. And so we need to keep these dimensions in perspective. The other event was the Bucharest NATO foreign ministers meeting and the meeting of that the Aspen Institute organized with the German Marshall Fund alongside that, an event that I used to participate in, which is important because coming to the regional initiatives, we have what one calls in Anglo-Saxon parlance an alphabet soup of regional initiatives. There is, of course, the 3Cs initiative. In the Balkans, we have CEFTA, we have the RCC, the Regional Cooperation Council. There is the Berlin process, which had a very good result recently under the chairmanship of Chancellor Scholz. There is the Open Balkans, which was already mentioned. There is the Adriatic Charter, which is linked to the NATO initiative. And so there is no lack of regional initiatives. The question is, are they tangible in terms of what the citizens feel about them? And are they producing what is required, a sense that we do belong to the Euro-Atlantic community? And just to remind you all, of course, and I think it is important to remind ourselves that 3 of the countries of the Balkans are full members of NATO, Albania, Montenegro, and most recently North Macedonia. And there are aspirant members as well in other parts of the region. Of course, Turkey is a longtime member of, and a very important neighbor on the southeastern flank of the Euro-Atlantic region. So a lot to talk about. I will stop here, not to belabor the point. And I will first ask Solomon Passi to give us a sense in his introductory remarks about how he sees the situation currently in the region and more broadly given what is happening with the Russian invasion.
Well, thank you, Ivan. First of all, I would like to thank the NATO Defense Foundation, Alessandro Minutorito, Alessandro Politi, and the organizer. Where is the mic? Shall I do something? Is it okay? Shall I continue speaking? Are you okay now? Not working? Now yes? Now yes, now it works. Okay, I will start from the beginning. I would like to thank, first of all, Alessandro Minutorito, Alessandro Politi, and the NATO Defense College Foundation for inviting me and for hosting this so timely conference. Actually, I remember, and all of us received the booklet from the previous conference, which was in 2021. And I was wondering what are the major differences between the previous conference and today's conference. The first of all, I would say something which happened only very recently in Bulgaria. This is that Italy took a new role vis-a-vis NATO security arrangements, and especially in Bulgaria. And next week I'm going to meet the Italian general invited by the Italian ambassador in Sofia. So congratulations to Italy and thank you for this leadership. The other thing which is, I would not put as a significance number 2, but the other one, this is the Russian invasion in Ukraine. This is so similar to the invasion of Hitler and Stalin in 1939 against Poland that it was unthinkable for me that it was possible. And the third thing, of course, is something that happened today. I saw on CNN that Zelensky, President Zelensky of Ukraine, became Man of the Year of Time magazine, which is really a world recognition of what is the situation today. In our invitation for this conference, we write for our panel that it is also very relevant in removing root causes which are causing instability in the region. Well, let's see which are the roots. And to my judgment, I would say that root number 2 is Russia, root number 3 is Russia, root number 4 is Russia, root number 5 is China, but root number 1, this is populism. This is populism which goes hand in hand with propaganda. Populism and propaganda are those who are the biggest enemies of democracy nowadays, and this is the same more or less since Socrates. Socrates was sentenced to death because of showing deficiencies of democracy. What is our strength? Our strength is in our unity. And what is our weakness? Our weakness is in our division. And the first aim of our enemy is to divide us. This is not a novelty. Divide et impera is a working slogan for centuries or millennia nowadays. So our first aim, by us I mean the people who want to direct the world forward, not backwards. Our first aim is to unite behind NATO, behind the European Union and all of its institutions like the Eurozone, like Schengen, with which Bulgaria nowadays has some problems to overcome. But given the existing realities, we need working solutions. By working solutions, I do not mean we do not need to pray, let us be better, but let us take concrete measures which are working at this concrete moment. The first thing that I believe is of utmost importance, this is NATO-EU cohesion. NATO-EU cohesion, which is much more possible and more relevant after Sweden and Finland joined NATO. And we need, I would say, at this moment, to have a rule in the European Union to accept new members only if they become members of NATO. NATO is an advantage. NATO should be advantage for EU membership, which this applies to Macedonia, to North Macedonia, to Albania, to Montenegro. And one big question I have to our moderator today: what about Austria's membership in NATO, as this is nowadays the only continental member of the European Union which is not member of NATO, and this is not okay, to put it that way. I will be ready during the discussion to propose concrete solutions for Georgia, for Ukraine, for Kosovo, for Moldova, for Bosnia and Herzegovina. But we need, first of all, to identify what is our biggest problem with Russia and what are our problems with China. The biggest problem with China is that we do not know China. We do not know China, and China is not in a hurry. China is the only nation which is capable to build a road today, which road will be used for the first time after 100 years. And this is a very special strategy to which Europe is not prepared. Our thinking is 4 years ahead until the next elections. And their thinking is maybe 4 centuries ahead until they conquer the world. So we need to give a very clear perspective to the next generation, what is the biggest challenge and how we shall address it. And I will be ready to run into this during the discussion.
Thank you very much. On very many things to discuss, and I'm glad you opened up a lot of issues that I'm sure we'll tackle during the course of the discussion. Ahmet Evin, obviously, as we said, and our friend Ivan Krastev recently wrote a piece on middle powers, Turkey has a pivotal role. It is a much bigger actor with around 80 million people and has a specific weight to throw around. But we're also seeing, for example, that it is waiting to give the green light to Finland and Sweden. So I'm sure you have much to say. Ahmed.
Thank you. Thank you, Ivan. inviting me and pursuing this challenging topic. But let me immediately say one thing that I do not have in my notes, anything regarding Turkey. But I would be glad to address if the Turkey question, if it comes up in the discussion. Western Balkans, surrounded by EU member states, still remain a gaping hole in map of Europe. Although the conditions for the inclusion of Western Balkans have been formulated as early as April 1997, very little progress to date has been made towards EU integration of the region. This was in part due to other items that topped the EU agenda. And today, as you mentioned, only 3 Western Balkan countries are NATO members, and none of the Western Balkan countries are EU members. But the slow progress of Western Balkans toward EU membership, I think, is also due to a significant degree to the ethnic, political, and cultural cleavages in the region, as well as within most countries in the region. Dimitar Bechev, an acute observer of the region, said earlier this year that the accession of Western Balkan countries to the EU has stalled due to issues both within the Union itself as well as the region itself. But I believe the deeply seated cleavages that characterize the region have been a more important factor that has prevented the region's convergence within the European entity than the Union's alleged lack of adequate attention to Western Balkans. As I tried to emphasize in earlier Balkan Perspectives conferences, the region as a whole has a strong centrifugal dynamics that substantially detract from a sense of coherence. Perhaps more importantly, a sense of shared geography among the varied groups living there. The centrifugal dynamic lends itself to fragmentation along ethnic, linguistic, confessional, and cultural lines. What, therefore, stands in the way of cosmopolitan convergence also prevents a consensus across the region's cleavages to pursue EU membership in a rigorous way. To the contrary, the centrifugal dynamics distributed across the region makes it easy for external actors to interfere and create clientelistic dependencies. China is one example. Russia, you have already mentioned. And I think politically, the Russian penetration of the Balkans have been most destructive among all this external influence, since it was implemented with a clear goal in mind to prevent EU enlargement into the region. Given, however, the sweeping changes that we're witnessing now in global geopolitics, one is compelled to ask whether there have not been any changes taking place, or these changes anticipated in the Balkans. Is the region likely to move faster towards a Euro-Atlantic inclusion since Russia's invasion of Ukraine? My quick answer to this question is possibly yes, but. By way of a tentative conclusion, let me bring to your attention 3 points regarding Western Balkans in the new geopolitics of the West. One is Russia's military aggression against Ukraine and the violence of its destructive attacks on the civilian population there have created a new border in Europe, one which separates the Russian Federation and its close ally Belarus from the rest of the continent. That division itself already demarcates a common European area in contradistinction to the Russian Federation. And it thus points to a cultural convergence based on similarity of preferences in the European area. This cannot be compared to rigorous forms of political integration that we associate with the EU, for example. The fact that none of the Western Balkan countries raised any objections to the European Council's January 22nd declaration this year to offer candidate status to Ukraine is a case in point. It's a positive case in point. However, old habits die hard. The centrifugal dynamics of the region and the sharp differences among the Balkan states are likely to persist. The fact that Bulgaria, a NATO member, has been standing in the way of two other NATO member states by slowing down their EU membership progress is yet another case in point.
It is over.
It's over now.
It's over.
But, I mean, it went on for quite a bit. Final point, regardless of an improved Euro-Atlantic affinity that may be in the making, as I suggest, especially since the Biden administration's transatlantic policies, the EU membership prospects for the region, I don't think lie in the very near future. For one, the EU member states have been experiencing a cumulative enlargement fatigue since the Big Bang enlargement of 2004. To give an example, the willful rejection by Hungary and Poland of the Union's basic principles is yet another case in point. Under the circumstances, it is hard to imagine that the EU would put widening before deepening. Even yesterday's conclusions emphasized continuous reform, reform, reform. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. You've opened a number of questions, which I hope we'll get back to. Just to say that, and to remind us all that North Macedonia really, with Greece, did a historic thing based on full understanding of the importance of Europe and its strategic future by achieving the Prespa Agreement, which, needless to say, was possible after Greece decided, after 27 years, to unblock Macedonia's road for it to become North Macedonia. But we must also be honest and frank and say that it was France that blocked North Macedonia and, by the same token, Albania in October 2019. And Bulgaria would not have done what it had done had France then given the green light. So there's a cascade of responsibility in the fact that we did not move at the moment when there was significant momentum after, and I repeat, and I insist, after a truly European historic decision to find a compromise in the best sense of the word. But let's move on to Bruno Lete, who has been working on this space of Europe and of the Euro-Atlantic area that borders Russia, and where the candidacy of Ukraine and Moldova, I think, was not only an extremely important symbolic move, which we all recognize, and I do hope that, by the way, Bosnia and Herzegovina gets candidate status now in the next few days. How do you see, Bruno, this dynamic with both Europe and NATO in this region?
Well, pleasure to be back together on the panel. Ivan, we were colleagues, as you mentioned, and thank you to the NATO Defense College Foundation for inviting me. It's always nice to be in Rome, not only because I left Brussels in 0 degrees temperature this morning, and I really prefer the 15 degrees in Rome. But let me perhaps make one clear point, first of all. Time after time, both EU and NATO enlargement have contributed to peace and stability in Europe. EU and NATO enlargement are not responsible for the war that we see today on the continent. I wanted to make this point first because we often hear the opposite nowadays, and this is a toxic narrative. Enlargement is not the cause of war in Europe today. Now, I'm from Brussels, so let me perhaps share, I'm based in Brussels, let me perhaps share some of the views that we see emerging now there, and some of the calculations that are now being made on Place Schuman. I want to focus a bit more on the EU here, because as a matter of fact, I think that NATO has done quite a good job to be pretty clear in managing expectations when it comes to enlargement. Whereas for the European Union, I think, yes, the EU is back on track when it comes to enlargement. I mean, the times of President Juncker that had put enlargement on hold are over. It's clear that Team van der Leyen is really trying to engage again in this subject. It's enlargement, yes, but there's a but. And I think it's important to understand what this but is about. Look, the European Union had often argued that enlargement doesn't move forward because candidate member states do not align with EU expectations, or they have pointing fingers at Russia or China. But it's important to understand that some of the major obstacles that prevent enlargement are also located in Brussels itself. And I think that there's three important things here that we have to look at. Three main obstacles in Brussels that are now basically shaping calculations to enlargement. It's politics, it's influence, and it's money. Let me perhaps briefly elaborate on those three. I mean, first of all, when it comes to politics, I think there's now a debate emerging in Brussels. Would the European Union still be governable if we add more member states? This is a discussion that is going on, and I think we see three camps of countries emerging. There's one camp that argues that before we enlarge, there must be a reform of the European Union. That would basically mean amendments or changes to the treaty. And the main point here is that unanimity should be weakened in favor of qualified majority voting, especially in domains like foreign policy or taxation. And we see that a country like Germany, but also the European Commission, is pushing for this. That's the first camp. The second camp is those countries that are actually opposed to a treaty change and that argue that we can actually enlarge without reforming the European Union. We hear this opinion mostly coming from Central and Eastern Europe, but also the Nordic countries. They actually argue that if you weaken the unanimity vote, that you would basically create a bunch of frustrated countries, and that the EU might be at risk of no longer speaking with one voice. That's their opinion. And then the third camp is actually the countries in the middle. There's always a middle as well, that actually argue that the EU doesn't need to reform, or the EU doesn't need to look for a treaty change, but that reforms are still possible without a treaty change, and that enlargement in that respect can move forward. That's, for instance, the position of France, among others. But I don't think that there will be any EU enlargement happening before that issue is resolved. Those three camps need to agree before we move forward. That's first. Second, it's about influence. There's some member states that argue that taking in, each time a new member state comes in, it changes powers distributions. Think about redistribution of European Parliament seats. A new member state also has the right to appoint commissioners, etc. So, we hear in Brussels sometimes these arguments that, well, okay, for smaller countries coming in, like, take Albania, for instance, that has a population of 3 million, the impact is less relevant. But, Ivan, you argued, for instance, a country like Ukraine, 40 million, it's massive. It's the size of Poland. For instance, redistributing the seats of the European Parliament, if Ukraine would come in, that's a major exercise. Some Western European countries also argue or are concerned that there might be a shift of power gravitas towards East Europe. Imagine, for instance, the emergence of a Warsaw-Kiev axis would this weaken the influence of a Berlin-Paris axis? So these are things that, that we do hear being mentioned in Brussels. And the fact that both Berlin and Paris are in favor of some reforms before enlarging are a testimony that they do have this concern. So, and then the third one, of course, is, as always, there's also an aspect of money involved. In the current economic conjuncture, there are some member states that argue that enlargement is simply too expensive. And you know, the EU has always been divided between those that are net contributors and net receivers of EU money. And it's exactly those net contributors that express concern about further enlargement and that first want clarity about, you know, what would be the bill for this, which I find a pretty narrow argument, but okay, it's just my personal opinion here. But take, for instance, an issue like agriculture, right? This is the largest EU budget, agriculture. It's about 365 billion euro in the multinational financial framework. Right now, France, for instance, is a country that benefits the most from this money, from this agricultural budget. But if you take in a country like Ukraine, that also has a very heavy agricultural economy, you know, it probably means that France would receive less money as well. And, you know, these are definitely things that need to be cleared out as well. What does this mean for the financial picture too? So I just want to, you know, point out to these debates that are happening in Brussels. But I do think, however, that having been a little bit skeptical now with these things that I mentioned, that there's also a lot of incentives in Brussels. I mean, it's clear that the EU now understands that, you know, enlargement will contribute to preserve peace and stability in the continent. I think it's also very important, and I know I'm getting close to time, but I do think that it's important that NATO is actively re-engaging in the Balkans and Eastern Europe. We also see a very influential re-engagement of the United States in the region, and I think that contributes as well to more stability there. But the second also, I think, is a shift in the economic world order. The EU is currently under intense pressure to join countries like China and the United States in this new game of economic self-interest and protectionism. And the EU is slowly but surely giving up on its ideal of free trade, I believe. And free trade was always exactly this tool where you could integrate countries economically without necessarily making them member states. But we see that, you know, this new shifts in the economic world order, that strategy is no longer, you know, free of flows. And so enlargement, of course, would be a means to secure new markets. And these are also calculations that are being made in Brussels. So I apologize for being a few seconds over time, but these are my practical, I would say, points of view on what's happening.
Thank you, Bruno. And I'd like to commend all three speakers for being very self-disciplined in terms of time. I will do a quick round of follow-up questions before I open it to the floor. Again, many questions have been raised, but let me just say 2 or 3 words. The question of deepening versus widening of the European Union has always been there. I mean, you know, since we know from at least the late 80s, I would say. And so I think these 2 things will move in tandem. But you're right, the whole issue of qualified majority voting, so that some things are unblocked, is one of these big issues that can be done without treaty change. Secondly, Russia. After the Thessaloniki summit in 2003, when the Western Balkans were told that they have an open door, in the famous words of Romano Prodi, who said they will join without ifs and buts, provided, of course, they meet the criteria. It was always said, for example, to us in Serbia, and I worked at some moment early on in 2000 with the Prime Minister, the European Union will never take in a new Cyprus, meaning never a country that has an unresolved territorial issue. Now, just look at the 3 new candidates, or rather potential candidates: Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. Russia has its big foot in each of these countries with unresolved territorial issues. In Georgia with Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and Moldova with Transnistria, and of course now in Ukraine with Crimea and the eastern Donbass. So we have a long way to go. Final point that I think is important, and it relates to how Europe, in my view at least, should act at this moment, try and bring these countries to the table wherever that is possible, on energy, on migration, on cyber, on agriculture, make them feel that they are part of these programs. The question really is, and I don't know whether it was in Macron's speech or somewhere, the question, does Europe want to be a bystander in this world? Because clearly nothing will be the same after this Russian invasion. Europe will wean itself off Russian gas and Russian fossil fuels. Yes, there is maybe an unprincipled scramble to the Saudi Arabias, the Azerbaijans, the Algerias to find new sources of energy, but we can discuss that. But first, quick follow-up question for Solomon Passi. Maybe on this energy issue, how has concretely Bulgaria been doing in weaning itself off? And do you see a role for Bulgaria in actually enhancing and being one of the champions of the Western Balkans enlargement?
Everything that is related to energy at this moment is very closely related to the climate policies. In particular, in Bulgaria, one of the heaviest problem to be solved, this is the decarbonization of energy, which was possible to be done, as we wanted 4 years, 5 years ago, to reduce by 40% the carbon emissions. This was possible before COVID. This was sustainable. Today, it is not anymore. So the combination of COVID plus the Russian war against Ukraine created new realities which require new solutions.
Ahmed, as we said, Turkey, and we have seen, Turkey has been in a tentative role as a mediator in an attempt to find common space between the Russian occupier and the Ukraine defender of its freedom. The grain deal, exchange of prisoners, and other things. Do you think that Turkey can continue and enhance that role as a possible mediator? We know that there are others who have lined themselves up in this tentative endeavor. And also this question that I mentioned before, how long do you think Turkey will hold out in impeding Finland and Sweden to join?
The first question is, one can answer that. I think with respect to the Green Deal, Turkey is a natural partner because it is agreed, and it was part of the deal that the ships will be controlled, and where they come from, where they're going, and so on and so forth. So basically, because of the Turkey's control gimmick. That is. If I may go back to your earlier question about Turkey and Balkans and why I did not particularly say anything about Turkey and the Balkans. So number one, I have very great difficulty understanding policies, if there are policies, of anger. I am unable to follow the reasoning of the government in a number of these things. Turkey's role in the Balkans at some point was very evident. There were a number of visits, orchestrated visits of the president and foreign minister and the common ancestral home of the Balkan peoples under the Ottoman rule and all that sort of romantic notion of embracing Balkans. But more recently, I think economic priorities of Turkey basically dictate a turn to investors, and investors basically lie in the Gulf, and also the opportunities that Turkey's open border with the Russian Federation, economic opportunities that relation brings. So I have not been observing that much of an emphasis on the Balkans, but certainly, as we have been talking with the ambassador, certainly a great deal of rather harsh and undiplomatic exchanges with Athens. The basic idea that, again, a withstanding pressure of the European Union and the Western Alliance on Turkey's claim on parts of the Mediterranean. So.
Okay, thank you, Ahmed. And of course, we need to remind ourselves that there is another country that's holding out on the ratification for Finland and Sweden, and that's Hungary, that has not yet voted in its parliament to ratify. Are we surprised? I don't know.
We understand more or less the reasons of Turkey, but do not understand the reasons of Hungary.
Yeah. And of course, in Turkey, there are elections coming, so that might be, as you said, another gimmick to go in that direction. Two small points. You mentioned the number of Russians in Istanbul. In Serbia, Belgrade, and Novi Sad, there's an estimated 100,000 Russians who have fled, left, and they compose basically an urban, professional, middle-class, intellectual elite. Whole companies in the IT sector have moved so that they continue working with the US on gaming industry and things of that sort. Bruno, I'm very glad you went into the nitty-gritty of the politics of Brussels. I think we need to know that it's not the shining city on the hill that sometimes we would like it to be, and the speculations about what an EU at 36 members would be is certainly on the minds of people. But again, what we saw in the Tirana summit just yesterday or the day before was it that the purse has been opened. I mean, there are really millions that have been forward. $1 billion actually has been offered for a variety of connectivity, energy, and other programs. But we also know that Ukraine needs monthly about $3 to $4 billion to keep going. How do you see the discussion going further as we go into the winter, which seems to be secured in European countries in terms of reserves of gas mainly?
Well, no, first of all, we all know that there was supposedly 18 billion euro that had to go to Ukraine from the European Union, but Hungary has now blocked that as well.
Hungary again?
Well, you know, they're pretty interested in Brussels, actually. But now Brussels is working out a deal among member states how to actually go around the Hungarian veto and try to still give a chunk of that money to Ukraine. But, you know, that's for that. Overall, yes, Ivan, you're right that you know, Ukraine is at war, a military conflict, but Ukraine is also in grave economic difficulty, of course. This is also prominently on the radar screen. The Zelensky administration predicted that the reconstruction of Ukraine would amount around $750 billion already. We're talking about bridges, roads, all kind of infrastructure that has to be reconstructed. Right now, you know, Russia is also actively destroying all civilian infrastructure when it comes to energy. So we do see that in the European Union, but also in North America, and on both sides of the Atlantic, there's now also active thinking about, you know, putting Ukraine back on track when it comes to economics. But that will be a very intense exercise. The Zelensky administration is now exploring options to create a trust fund that would address this, you know, $750 billion needed for reconstruction. The European Union has already announced that it's looking at, you know, more or less a contribution of 80 billion euro to this. That's what President von der Leyen said a few weeks ago, but no one really knows who will contribute to these 80 billions, when they will be available, so that still remains to be seen a little bit. And of course, on the other side of the Atlantic, the Biden administration has also announced similar plans to you know, be generous in terms of economic aid to Ukraine. But you know, this is what we call this almost called Marshall Plan, you know, a term that we've been hearing as well quite often. Look, in my opinion, you know, this money will be given to Ukraine, because I think we all realize that, you know, a prosperous Ukraine will also contribute to peace and stability on the continent. You know, the big question is just when will this money be made available? Especially we are in the winter these days, so the issue of timing is critical. And of course, given that is also an issue that is linked to unanimity voting again, it doesn't make things easier to reach an agreement. But again, I am hopeful actually that in terms of financial aid and helping Ukraine to get back on track economically, the West, as we call it, will be there to support Ukraine. That's for sure.
Okay, thank you. So let's open it out now to your questions and comments. And I already see one right here. If we could have a microphone right here, please, in the second row. And could you please introduce yourself?
Thank you. My
Yep.
name is...
Yeah. Yeah. Is it? Yeah, working. Okay.
My name is Vesel Mehmedi. I'm ambassador of North Macedonia here in Italy, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And I want to ask just one question, and I hope it will refer to all three guests that we have here. For Western Balkans, there is no doubt that the attraction force for all Western Balkan countries is EU and NATO. Regardless that this target is a moving target. As Bruno talked about 3 camps, and still that we have 3 camps and it moves all the time with new rules and new procedures and new methodology, still the attraction force for Western Balkans is EU. What I don't understand until now, and I hope I'm wrong, and I'm asking the guest here, what is the attraction force for EU? I'm trying to find out, or in other words, what exactly do we have to do in order to be attractive to EU? What kind of shock do you want to hear from us? Because we are pretty good at producing shocks. So we can do that in order to be attractive, because right now I don't see what is the attraction force for EU. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody want to? Bruno, you want to start?
Well, I understand that you have a hard time to understand how to be attractive. It's hard to be attractive to a bureaucrat. But look, I think there's two things here. First of all, it's an inherent element in the EU security strategy to work on a continent of prosperous and stable countries. So, if the European Union is joined by more and more member states that are stable, secured, and where the economy is growing, that's already an attractive point. That's an inherent point of EU strategy. The second one, of course, is, as I said, this is pure practical real thinking. Each country represents an economic market with customers and citizens, and the European Union, of course, is also interested in that, to extend trade, economics, etc. So for me, it's just, again, this strategy of wanting a continent that is stable, peaceful, and having growing economy, that makes it attractive. And you can only achieve this if everyone's on board, not just some of board and the others are not. And that's the attraction, I think.
Solomon, Ahmed?
Well, more or less the same thing. As I mentioned at the beginning of what I was saying, that this area of vacuum that by definition is not a stable area is not something that the EU wants. But by the same token, the EU does not want to integrate that before it achieves stability in that region. So this is, I think, the crux of the problem that we have been really addressing here.
Well, you know very well what is the difference between the mouse and the hummock, the small animal. The second animal, you keep it at home, and the first animal you don't want to be close to. What is the difference? They're practically the same biological entities, but the difference is in the PR. So if you want more attraction, to attract more Brussels, you need better PR. This is as easy as that. Of course, having said that, you have to follow the criteria and bargain with the rest. It is. I spoke today with the Deputy Prime Minister of Macedonia, and this is not a secret that we were talking about double standards. We have to be lucky if the standards in Brussels are double, because as a rule they're triple. We have to fight with everybody. And look, I have listened very carefully to what Ivan and Professor Evin mentioned before. We have Turkey bargaining with Sweden and Finland for NATO. This is sort of a bargain, which is we want to show muscles to the electorate. We have Bulgaria more or less in the same situation vis-à-vis Macedonia and the European Union. At this very moment, we have the same problem with the Netherlands, who do not want to admit Bulgaria to join Schengen for reasons which are not understandable. There are no measurables there. Practically, they say, we don't love you. Okay, when are you going to start loving us? I don't know, and there is no timetable for starting the love. We have four members of NATO which do not permit Kosovo to join what? To join the United Nations. Not NATO, not the European Union, the United Nations. We have four of NATO. We have 5 of the European Union who do not permit Kosovo to join the United Nations. And it is United Nations, it is not NATO and the European Union. And if we go back in the history, we should remember that General de Gaulle put twice, if I'm not mistaken, twice veto over membership of the UK in the EU. Why? Today, 55 years ago, is there anybody, Alessandro, is there anybody who can explain us why was this? Is there any reason, maybe it was the same reason de Gaulle put the same veto for UK, which Macron put 2 years ago for Macedonia. After 55 years, no one will understand us. And our biggest enemy is populism. This is populism. All of these examples which I gave here are rooted in populism. And if we say that it was a mistake to accept Cyprus in EU, no, it was not a mistake. The mistake would be the opposite, not to invite Cyprus, because we made the same mistake, and who made it in the European Union? It was France and Germany. They did not permit Ukraine to join NATO. They did not permit Georgia and Ukraine in 2008 to join NATO, and immediately after that, Putin invaded Georgia. Immediately after that, in 2008, we as if opened the door for him to invade Georgia. So it will be very smart at this moment to invite Georgia to join NATO, never mind that we have 2 frozen conflicts in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. It will be smart to invite Moldova to join NATO. Okay, if they have problem with their constitution, the solution in Moldova would be to join Romania. In the same way in which, if we continue to keep Kosovo in the refrigerator, the solution for Kosovo would be to join Albania. These are working solutions. These are not theories. These are working solutions, because in the same time we have Russia working every day against us. Maybe you don't know, but according to the Bulgarian think tanks which are carefully studying this, we have 400 pieces per day of fake news, 400 per day, fake news produced by Russia and infiltrated in Bulgaria. They're meddling into the Bulgarian public opinion as no one else. They're investing huge amount of money. So if we need to do something really great, this is to open a de-brainwashing program. We need de-brainwashing program, and it's a pity that Nicole DeSantis is not here, because I was planning to ask him, are we planning in NATO to open a really serious intergovernmental program to fight propaganda. Propaganda is the biggest enemy and the strongest arm, the strongest weapon of our opponents and enemies.
No, absolutely. That's one of the crucial questions. You've raised a very contentious issue, of course, of changing borders in Europe, but let's leave that for some other time. Any other? Yes, please, over there, and then back there. Let's take 2 questions in a row.
Thank you very much for allowing me to speak. My name is Nasser al-Balushi. I am the ambassador of Bahrain to Kingdom of Bahrain, to Italy, and also non-resident ambassador to Slovenia. That's why this is and other Balkanic countries also. So my question is, there are a lot of incidents that has happened, to Europe since the First World War. So the first one, the second one, and then there has been the separation and separation of the countries from the Balkan area to be independent. They separated from Russia. Now you have about to integrate all the countries, together. There are some in the pipeline. But what is the lesson now learned from this war? This war has happened today. Russia is invading, and your dependence, especially from energy point of view, Europe has abandoned many other alternatives to diversify their energy sources, and they depended on Russia. So there are three questions that Europe has to diversify its resources. It has to start from now. Second thing, developing alternative energy, maybe solar or others, which are not very expensive and does not take big space. And third thing, why you are not thinking about nuclear energy another time, revisit the issue and concentrate on, concentrating on this, perfectioning the technology so that it could become a good source of energy, which has, without any incident. France depended on 80% on nuclear energy at one point. The second thing, I remember after the Second World War, there was after the discovery of oil in our region, Saudi Arabia and others, we have, with the Americans, we have built a pipeline starting from the region in Saudi Arabia to Tartus in Syria. This is not working now, but the pipelines are there. We should rethink about how we can, benefit from these abundant, let me say, pipeline, and revisit it again and do something about it so that you can, in one way or another, diversify your energy. Because alternative energy cannot take a solution.
Thank you.
One last word, is that in 1975 in Venice, I remember very well, I read this, the European Union integrator at that time, it was Giscard d'Estaing, I think the president, and they wanted to make a divorce between rate of growth of the economies of European Union and the use of energy, consumption of energy. But they succeeded and then they returned when the prices became cheaper. Okay. So I think we have to think about it very seriously and diversify your economies. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question back there. Briefly, if possible. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Tullio Morganti. I'm a freelance consultant in public governance, and I would like to give positive support to the question that His Excellency, the Ambassador of North Macedonia, has just asked. I spent 5 years of my life in Skopje, advising the government on different issues. Since 1994, I was locked in the country in 1994, 1995. I was again back in 2013 working with the Ministry of Administrative Reform and Information Society. And I can confirm that all what Macedonia in those years, since when I saw it first, 1994, till when I left, has done to comply with what the European Union was asking, was done. Many hot issues were resolved, especially the contentious relationship with their biggest minority. And Macedonia, I think, honestly, today, after having seen it, having worked shoulder to shoulder with deputy ministers and ministers, would be more than ready to join the Union. You know, I'm a passionate, I was, as a student, a passionate supporter of East-West integration. I've lost a bit looking at how the European Union functions, mostly in the Balkans, Bosnia, Serbia, Kosovo, Slovenia. But Macedonia, I think, among all, is the one which is the most ready to join us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we have a final round from our speakers here. We have the question from the Ambassador of Bahrain, which is basically tackling the broader issue of climate and energy, need for renewables, diversifying energy supplies, and of course the question of nuclear, and then a broader question on who is qualified to move faster than others. So I'll start in reverse order with Bruno, and any other question you want to address in your final remarks, and we have about 10 minutes, say.
I need 2.
Okay.
Very broad context, Mr. Ambassador. I think a couple of points. Is the de-Europeanization of Russia, especially when it comes to energy and a reorientation to Central Asia and Asia. But I don't think that Russia will have an easy time to decouple its economy and energy from Europe, and its revenue will be lower because Asian clients are not as well paying as Europeans. I think this isolation will take at least 5 or 6 years still. I don't see Russia recovering from this very fast. I also see an erosion of Russian-Chinese relations because of the current war. And I also do believe that China will think twice before invading Taiwan after seeing the Western reaction. In the end, when it comes to energy, I think the United States emerges as the country that benefits the most. The United States is consolidating its global role and especially is making a lot of new clients in Europe. But on the other hand, we also see that European-American relations or transatlantic relations are back on track, at least for now, also in the field of energy. I think that we will have quite a very healthy and productive cooperation there. But there's, of course, American elections in a couple of years coming up, so we'll also see what's there. For Europe, I think I'm actually pretty enthusiastic when it comes to energy. I think we will move fast. I think that Russia will be hurt more than we will in the end, because we are investing in renewables and actually de-Russifying our energy infrastructure. So when it comes to energy, I'm pretty optimistic.
Thank you, Bruno. Ahmed.
Yes, I agree. Let me add one thing to the energy discussion. What Europe faced was the fast disappearance of a large amount of gas that cannot be replaced very fast. And still, I think the progress has been quite good, much better than expected. We also, I must add, that we owe the climate of China some of this relief, because the lockdowns in China, as a result of the lockdowns in China, demand fell, and contracted LNG could then be also diverted to Europe. There is the transition away from Russian gas is continuing. We might, depending on the weather and other factors, we might have next year a bit of a difficult time. But I think 2 years from now, I think basically Europe will have weaned itself from Russian gas. So it is quite an amazing feat and a show of discipline that Europe has proved that it's capable of.
Solomon.
I would like to come once again to the example of Cyprus, because it is a very indicative example. It is something like a case study for frozen conflicts. And it is applicable elsewhere. I wouldn't say universally applicable, but elsewhere applicable. In particular, we can apply the same approach in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We can give 2 tracks for the 2 parts of this country. One track for Republika Srpska, and another track for the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I don't want to go now into details telling what to do with Brečko. But this is really a solution for the region. The Federation wants to join the Western clubs, and we should not stop them because someone else does not want to join the Western clubs. And we have to apply the similar principal approach to Taiwan, as it was mentioned a minute ago, because we need to develop strategic relationship between the West and Taiwan. Taiwan is the last stopper of China before going worldwide. We have studied even Chinese space program in my organization, the Atlantic Club, and we know what is the planning of China to conquer the space, what is the planning of China to conquer the North Pole, what is the planning of China to conquer the world. And I cannot talk on behalf of my generation, but I'm talking now on behalf of the generation of our children. This is our strategic need, to look forward and to get rid of the taboos of the past.
Thank you, Solomon. A few closing words from me before I thank our three distinguished panelists. There was the question on Austrian neutrality, which I want to address in 2 sentences. I was, in fact, in Vienna 2 days ago in a discussion on this. It's obviously, there are historical reasons. As you know, Austria was occupied by the 4 Allied powers for 10 years after 1945 until 1955, and we were in a grand Viennese building, the House of Industry on Karl Schwarzenberg Platz, and then the head of the Federation of Business People said, you know, this was called Stalinplatz until 1955. And I asked the rhetorical question, would you have the same opinion of neutrality if your border was with Russia? And then they kind of asked themselves what would happen. But neutrality is ingrained, and one younger person said, we grew up with neutrality, this is part of our political being, so I don't think we can expect any changes, whatever we may think about Austrian neutrality. Kosovo was mentioned. I think it's very important to say that I don't think it's too strong a word, that it's a scandal that Kosovo doesn't have a visa-free regime with Europe. Ukraine has a free regime, Moldova has a free regime, and Kosovo is being held out. There's a promise that they will get it at the end of next year. It's a bit like your love relationship with the Netherlands, which I'm glad that you mentioned, because, as you know, the decision on whether Romania, Bulgaria, and Croatia join the Schengen regime will be taken in the next few days. And it must be reminded that Europe is advancing in fits and starts, and Croatia will become a Eurozone country in 3 weeks' time. So not everything is lost. To the ambassador's question, I think it's important to ask the question, what is the cost of non-Europe in this whole area? And the cost is very high. There was a complacency, as I said, you know, there won't be war in this region. Unfortunately, we did war in the 90s in the worst way possible. I don't think there's any energy for war. And I'm glad that Ambassador Minuto-Ritsa reminded us that NATO is in Kosovo, 4,000 strong troops. And so there might be some minor violence, but NATO will step in very strongly if there is something more happening. But the homework is in our countries, in our 6 Western Balkan countries, to become better for ourselves, more democratic, more rules-based, more independence of judiciary. And I want to add very significantly and emphatically that sometimes you need to go the extra mile and take decisions that may not be appropriate by the rules. And here I'm talking about Romania and Bulgaria joining as members of NATO and the European Union in 2007. They didn't clearly have an independent judiciary. There was lots of corruption and bad governance. But imagine if today Romania and Bulgaria were not members of the European Union and NATO. This would be an open border for, God forbid, Russia to move in if they ever decided to go down that Black Sea path. So there are geopolitical and geostrategic decisions that require courage, that require boldness, and I think we are seeing some initial steps by giving candidacy to Ukraine and Moldova, hopefully to Bosnia and Herzegovina, so that the Euro-Atlantic dimension of our continent is strengthened so that we are all together an active player on a global scene where, again, as Solomon Passi said, China is a patient actor and is ready to conquer the world in the next 70 years, whereas we are on election cycles every 2, 3, 4, and 5 years. We need to be thinking much more strategically if we do not want to become the Venice of the future world, where people will come and enjoy how the Serenissima looked at the height of its power. Thank you very much for your patience. We now have a coffee break, and thank you to our speakers. I love going to Venice, by the way.
Yeah, well,
Everybody.
you're in the Brussels office.
Yes.
With Ian.
Bene.
GMF Brussels. Yeah, with Ian.
Sei
exactly.
contento?
Yeah, with Ian, working with him quite often. He couldn't. I know he's coming quite often to Rome, but this time I was summoned. Thank you, sir.